December 6, 1957. The United States prepares to prove it can compete in the space race. Millions watch live television as a rocket slowly rises from the launch pad. And then, just seconds later, collapses into a fireball. This was not just a launch failure. It was a moment that reshaped American space policy, in front of the entire world. So what actually caused the rocket that exploded live on television? In 1957, spaceflight was not only about science. It was about global prestige. Just weeks earlier, the Soviet Union had shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. Then came Sputnik 2, carrying the dog Laika into orbit. To many Americans, it felt like the United States had suddenly fallen behind. The U.S. government needed a visible response, quickly. That response would be Project Vanguard, a civilian scientific satellite program led by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. Unlike military rocket programs, Vanguard was intended to demonstrate peaceful scientific leadership. But it was also under intense political pressure to succeed. And that pressure would shape what happened next. The vehicle prepared for launch was Vanguard TV-3. It was designed as a three-stage launch system capable of placing a small scientific satellite into orbit. Technically, the rocket represented cutting-edge engineering for its time, lightweight structures, experimental propulsion systems, and precision guidance controls. Because of the international attention surrounding Sputnik, the launch was broadcast live on television. Reporters gathered. Cameras rolled. Commentators prepared to announce America's entry into the space age. At ignition, everything appeared normal. The engines lit, flames expanded beneath the rocket. The vehicle began rising slowly from the pad. For a moment, it looked like success. Then, only about 2 seconds after liftoff, thrust suddenly dropped. The rocket lost momentum, fell back onto the launch pad, and exploded in a massive fireball. The satellite, still transmitting, was thrown clear of the explosion and continued beeping from the ground nearby. The world had just watched America's first televised space launch fail in real time. Initial speculation suggested many possible causes: engine malfunction, fuel system instability, guidance failure, structural weakness. But the investigation quickly focused on the first-stage propulsion system. Evidence showed that shortly after liftoff, fuel pressure in the engine dropped dramatically, causing thrust to fall below the level needed to sustain flight. Without sufficient thrust, the rocket could not continue climbing. Gravity took over, pulling the vehicle back onto the pad, where remaining fuel ignited in the explosion. Further technical analysis pointed to a failure in the fuel feed system, likely involving inadequate pressure regulation that prevented proper propellant delivery to the engine. This was not sabotage. It was not a mysterious unknown force. It was a propulsion system that simply could not maintain stable thrust during the first seconds of flight. But the technical explanation did not reduce the political consequences. Because the failure happened live, in front of the entire world. Launch failures were not unusual in early rocketry. Both the United States and the Soviet Union experienced many unsuccessful test flights. What made Vanguard TV-3 different was visibility. This was one of the first major rocket launches ever broadcast live on television. Millions of viewers saw the rocket rise, and then explode only seconds later. International newspapers quickly published images of the burning launch pad. Foreign commentators used the event as evidence that the United States was falling behind technologically. Inside Washington, the failure intensified political urgency. Leaders realized that space achievements were no longer purely scientific milestones, they were demonstrations of national capability. And that realization triggered major changes in American space strategy. The explosion of Vanguard TV-3 was more than a failed launch. It became a symbol. In late 1957, the United States was already under pressure after Sputnik. Schools were questioning science education. Newspapers were questioning defense preparedness. Lawmakers were questioning leadership. Now, the world had seen America's answer to Sputnik collapse in flames. Headlines described it as a national embarrassment. Political opponents used it as evidence that the United States lacked urgency in missile and space development. But inside the technical community, the reaction was different. Engineers understood something critical: Vanguard was an experimental research vehicle. It was never the only American rocket capable of reaching orbit. At the same time Vanguard was struggling, another team, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, led by Wernher von Braun, had a modified Redstone missile ready that could potentially launch a satellite. However, before Sputnik, that military option had not been prioritized for the International Geophysical Year satellite mission. After the Vanguard failure, priorities shifted rapidly. Following the televised explosion, U.S. officials authorized the Army team to proceed. On January 31, 1958, less than 2 months after Vanguard TV-3, the United States successfully launched Explorer 1 into orbit using a Jupiter C rocket. Explorer 1 did more than restore confidence. It carried a scientific instrument designed by physicist James Van Allen. That instrument detected intense bands of radiation surrounding Earth, now known as the Van Allen radiation belts. Ironically, the mission that followed a public humiliation produced a major scientific discovery. But even as Explorer 1 succeeded, the broader lesson from Vanguard remained. The United States did not yet have a unified civilian space agency. Multiple military and research groups were pursuing space technology independently. The space race demanded coordination. The events of 1957, Sputnik, Vanguard's explosion, and Explorer's success, accelerated political action. In July 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act. On October 1, 1958, NASA officially began operations. The failure of Vanguard TV-3 did not create NASA by itself. But it intensified public awareness and political momentum. The United States realized that space was not a temporary scientific project. It was a long-term strategic frontier. And future launches would need stronger systems integration, better propulsion reliability, clearer mission ownership, greater technical coordination. Vanguard continued flying after the failure. Later Vanguard launches did successfully place satellites into orbit. But TV-3 remained the image most people remembered. Because it happened live. Let's return to the central question: what caused the rocket that exploded live on TV? The investigation determined, the first stage engine experienced a rapid drop in fuel pressure seconds after liftoff. That drop reduced thrust below what was required to sustain ascent. The vehicle lost lift, fell back to the pad, and the remaining propellant detonated upon impact. There was no conspiracy. No secret design flaw hidden from the public. No dramatic last-minute sabotage. It was a propulsion system failure during the most vulnerable phase of flight, the first seconds after ignition. Early rocketry was unforgiving. Margins were thin. Materials were new. Systems were experimental. And early spaceflight accepted risks that modern aerospace engineering would never allow. Vanguard TV-3 did not fail because American engineers were incompetent. It failed because the United States was still learning how to build reliable launch vehicles. The explosion became famous not because it was unique, but because it was visible. Space exploration has always included failure. But public failure changes how nations respond. Vanguard's televised explosion forced urgency. Urgency led to coordination. Coordination led to NASA. And NASA would go on to launch astronauts into orbit. Land humans on the moon. Build space telescopes. Develop deep space probes. In that sense, the rocket that exploded in front of the world became part of the foundation of American space leadership. It was a moment of humiliation. But it was also a moment of transformation. Because in spaceflight, failure is not the opposite of success. It is often the beginning of it. And the fireball that the world watched in 1957 became one of the sparks that ignited America's path to the moon.